Now, the topic as advertised is Australia in 2050. Questions will be invited from members of the audience when all of our three speakers have concluded, and I will invite the first speaker in the lineup. Excuse me. And the first speaker is Dr. Alison Bronowski, former Australian diplomat to Southeast Asian countries and to the United Nations since 1996. She's been an academic and writer in Asian studies, and she is the author of various very interesting books. Author of The Yellow Lady, Australian Representations in Asia, 1991, About Face, Asian Accounts of Australia, in 2003, Howard's War, also in 2003, and Allied and Addicted in 2007.
CO2 emissions or to develop alternative energies, in spite of our potential to do so. And like many countries, Australia is trying to plan for 2050. At the Academy of Science in Canberra recently, just earlier this year, 36 leading scientists completed work on a 3-year project called Towards an Environmentally Sustainable and Socially Equitable Way of Living. And the first volume was launched by the Governor-General. It's called Negotiating a Future, Living Scenario for Australia to 2050. But, as I said before, that's the easy part. It's a lot easier to make predictions than to execute plans. I don't know whether that's too small for you to see, but that's growth in economic growth and the changes in ranks of countries at present, per capita income growth and population growth compared to various countries. Australia has slightly slid down the list from 11th to where it is now, to where it is in 2050, and China is on top of economic size, and so on, and it goes on like that. If you want to look at it more closely later, I can show it to you. Let's just get away from the hard numbers for a while and think about something that interests me much more. You'll remember, if you haven't read about it, you might have remembered Margaret Thatcher, of all people, talking about it, about Easter Island. Remember I said early on, the Easter Island experience was something I was going to mention at this point. Maggie Thatcher read a book about Easter Island in which she realized that the people of the island eliminated themselves because they went on cutting down the trees that had clothed, fed, and housed them, and provided their medicine and done everything for them until there was not one tree left. And the reason that they cut the trees down was to help them to move and construct vast stone monuments to their ancestors, most of whom looked like Malcolm Fraser. That's what they do. Competing with each other in making more magnificent ones. And went on doing that until they cut them all down, and they couldn't even make a canoe to get away. Maggie Thatcher was very moved by this. Didn't make any difference to her political policies, unfortunately, but the point was, and she got it long before a lot of other people did, that we think of ourselves as advanced and civilized, but we appear, unless we learn from the example of Easter Island, to have learned nothing at all. And even facing the pressures we do that I've mentioned of population, environment, climate, water, and resources, we still live for today or for the next 3 years or for our retirement, no more. Our economics is based on endless growth and endless waste, which can't go on. Not on recycling everything, which is what it should be based on. bees and ants and butterflies are better forward planners than humans and better organisers of societies, I submit. The only real forward planning that we do in our societies is for defence, or you might say for the military. We still pour enormous energy, resources and money into finding smarter and smarter ways to kill each other. Easter Island? Getting away then. Oh yeah, I didn't show you that one, but there's another example of how big the GNP is going to be and which ones are going to be big. Getting away from physical survival, what interests me about the future is whether we can actually live together in societies without destroying each other. You may have read a little book by Susan George, published in 2003, the second edition. It's a remarkable piece of work. It looks like a boring, it's actually printed to look like a boring report from a consultant to a group that have hired the consultant to report to them. And that's just what it is. The fictional team of consultants from a group of Western nations hires these smart people to write a report on how to preserve capitalism in the 21st century. How to preserve capitalism in the 21st century. Now, like all such reports, it does just what it's supposed to do, a SWOT analysis, right? Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And this seems as dry and rational as you could imagine. And it leads you step by step through the arguments, as you would expect it to do, about all the needs that humans have, etc., etc. And it narrows down to the conclusion towards about halfway through, and then it gets narrower and narrower, that the poor will be numerous, young and hungry, and the rich will be few and old. And they will want their way of life to survive. But they won't be able to fight for it, either physically, nor economically, nor politically. So what to do? And the solution that the report reaches is absolutely chilling. Provide the poor with the means to fight each other. Divide them and you will continue to rule. Now, when you think of what's going on in today's world, Susan George's fantasy is not all that far off the mark. And what is going on in Syria right now is being seen by some people who are reflecting on it as part of a major plan by certain countries to pick off the non-conformers in the Middle East and roll them one by one. Libya, Egypt, Iran will be next, Iraq's done, Afghanistan's done. Think about it. The only difference is that it hasn't followed Susan George's theory up to now, but it's beginning to. Stay out of the fight and let them fight themselves. Give them the stuff to fight with, including chemical weapons, right? And let them go for it. This is what is happening, ladies and gentlemen. And it is being acted out before our eyes. Susan George doesn't even know, when she wrote this book, she may have known, but she didn't think much about drones or the possibility of portable nuclear weapons or the means of cyber attacks getting into the hands of the poor, which is distinctly possible by 2050. And the countries that now have those technologies and are using them will get a very rude shock when the countries they use them on start to have them too and start to use them back. Don't forget, 9/11 was the big example of blowback. What had been done came back in spades. And what we are seeing, what I find much more interesting than all those dry statistics I was showing you, right, is this aspect of the years to 2050, when the things that we have been doing with gay abandon come back to bite us. Now, this is all a bit dark, and I don't want to leave you all feeling depressed. If we want, we can choose a different direction, and there's still time, and groups like yours are doing really good work in stimulating discussion about it. But I'll say again, planning and discussion are the easy part. Executing anything, putting the plans into practice is the hard part. You only have to consider, as an example, what's happened to Australia's relatively timid plans to deal with climate change and mining profits and a few other rational steps towards the future. So the most reassuring thing I think I can leave you with is to say that if you were born after 1950, you may well be alive, according to the statistics, in 2050 to see what becomes of us. But if you were born before 1950, you won't have to.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alison Bernowski. I won't say that was chilling, but it was challenging. It was very challenging. That's what we need, isn't it? Lots of that. Now, our second speaker in order is Dr. Ashley Lavelle. And he is a lecturer in the Department of Politics and Public Policy at Griffith University, and the author of The Death of Social Democracy and Political Consequences in the 21st Century, also the author of Politics of Betrayal, Renegades and Ex-Radicals from Mussolini to Christopher Hitchens, just published by the Manchester University Press, and currently researching on the politics of the nuclear family. And also his research and teaching interests include social movements, radical politics, Marxism, Australian politics, political institutions, etc. Welcome, Dr. Ashley Lavelle.
Thanks very much for the invitation to come and speak here. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are currently occupying. Well, I think that in the wake of the election over the weekend, this is a good time to be talking about the future. The year 2050 is quite some time away, and I have to say, to me, it doesn't portray a pretty picture. And in fact, I think things look pretty grim by that stage. And maybe it's not quite a dystopian nightmare of a Hollywood science fiction film, but then again, we can't rule that out because there have been many predictions, partly based on some of what Alison was talking about there in relation to the environment. If you look at the world at the moment, it's in a mess. Let's face it. It's an era of war and revolution. You know, we've seen in the last few years the worst global recession since the Great Depression. We've seen large European economies have to be bailed out, threatening to go bankrupt. We've seen revolutions breaking out in the Middle East, the Arab Spring, the so-called Arab Spring. We've seen tensions developing amongst major powers. We see the Americans contemplating bombing Syria, adding to the list of countries in which they're at war. The international context is one of great uncertainty, crisis, fear, foreboding. It's an ugly setup in many ways. And to some extent, Australia has been a little bit exempt from this madness around the world. And that's, of course, got a lot to do with the fact that the Australian economy hasn't suffered a recession since the early 1990s. But as we all know, capitalism as an economic system is based on recessions and booms. They have to happen at some point. And when it comes, we can expect a very nasty hangover from the good times. If we look at the environment for one, I guess the first question we should be asking ourselves is, will we actually be around in 2050 as human beings to look at the world? A number of people have made some very, very dire predictions. People, climate scientologists, people who know a lot more about global warming than I do, think that if governments continue on the path they are currently going on, we are heading towards disaster, catastrophe. We had a professor at AU, the late Frank Fenner, whose opinion was that it's already too late for humanity, that we've gone too far. That may not be the case, but recently we've seen leaks from the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change showing that the rate of ice melting in the Antarctic and Greenland has been speeding up. Predictions that the temperature of the world will rise by 5 degrees by the end of the century. Just here in Sydney, New South Wales, we've had the warmest winter in 150 years. The warmest January to August period this year on record. And of course we've also seen this extraordinary start to the fire season at the beginning of spring. These are, according to our new Prime Minister, evidence simply of the variability of our climate. But the bulk of the world's scientific community see this, or these sorts of events, as indicative of a warming climate. However, alongside these sort of catastrophic possible outcomes, we've seen basically very little action from Australia's major parties, and again, which is indicative of international trends. But even if the Rudd government had been re-elected, it's unlikely that their emissions trading scheme would have reduced greenhouse gases by anywhere near enough on an international level to make a difference. And most serious studies of the coalition's policy, so-called direct action, don't believe that they will be able to reduce greenhouse gases by anywhere near that's needed. So the environment's a pretty serious area, and an indicator, I think, of where we're heading at the moment on current trends. If you look at some of the major outbreaks of class conflict that have occurred around the world, the global financial crisis has thrust millions of people into poverty. We saw 10 million plus Americans thrown out of their homes, millions of people lose their jobs. We've seen in Greece a pensioner commit suicide out the front of the Greek parliament because he couldn't afford food and basic items. We've seen people in Spain jumping off balconies, committing suicide because they can't pay their rent anymore. These sorts of things, as I said before, haven't yet come to Australia, but the global financial crisis is a warning sign of how deep a mess international capitalism is in. And it really is quite frightening to think that if the most recent global crash is the worst since the Great Depression, what lies ahead for us in the future. But we have seen in Australia, even